The wind off the rim rocks came down hard on Billings that Monday morning, carrying the smell of coming snow, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees since sunrise by the time Sergeant First Class Nate Crow pulled his truck to the curb on Montana Avenue at 10:30. In the passenger seat, Rue raised her head. Then she put both forepaws on the dash, the thing she only did when she had already decided something. On a wooden bench outside the Billings Public Library sat an old man in an army field jacket, alone, holding a newspaper he was not reading. He was very still. Not the stillness of peace, the stillness of a man who had made himself small, over time, the way people make themselves small when the world has stopped leaving room for them. What that dog did next, before Nate had opened his door, before he had said a single word, would begin to unravel something a grief counselor, a VA therapist, and 3 years of silence had not been able to reach. This channel tells one story at a time, and this is the one for today. If you're new here, subscribe so you're present for the next one. Nate Crow was 32 years old and had gone into the Army the week after his high school graduation, not because he had a plan, but because his older brother Marcus had served, and because Billings, in that particular June, had felt like a place he was about to outgrow before he was ready to leave it. He had meant to do one tour and come home and figure out the next thing. 3 tours later, the next thing was still not fully assembled, and he was living in a rental on the south side of Billings and driving supply runs twice a week for the Veterans Resource Center on 9th Street, which was not a job so much as a reason to leave the house and be somewhere that didn't require him to translate himself. It was not a man who talked about what the deployments had done to him, not because the words weren't there, but because they never came out in the right order. It had left Billings at 18 knowing exactly who he was, and come back at 30 knowing that far more precisely, and the gap between those two versions of himself was large and specific and shaped like the 11 months after Kandahar that he did not discuss. His brother Marcus had died in Helmand Province in 2011, 3 months before Nate's first deployment. Nate had learned to carry that the way you carry something you cannot put down, not by forgetting it was there, but by building everything else around the weight of it. What the third tour had added was Danny Park. Danny had been 24 years old and the best spotter Nate had ever worked beside. Quick, careful, and possessed of an ability to read a situation from its edges that Nate had never seen in another soldier. It had grown up in Colorado Springs, the grandson of a Korean immigrant who had come to America after the war with a single story he told once, to Danny, when Danny was 12. An American soldier at Incheon had pulled him from a collapsed building and stayed with him through 2 nights in the cold until evac reached them. Danny's grandfather had named his firstborn son after that soldier's unit number. He never learned the man's name. Danny told Nate that story 3 weeks before Kandahar, in the dark doing the things soldiers do when it is quiet and they have run out of other things to say. Nate had thought about it afterward. Then Kandahar happened, and Danny was gone and there was no one left to tell it to. Nate drove Highway 212 and thought about Danny Park approximately every 12 minutes. Rue was a Belgian Malinos, red-coated and lean, retired from IED detection after 4 years and 2 deployments. She weighed 61 pounds and had a scar on her right shoulder that pulled the fur in a small whorl, and she was the most perceptive creature Nate had encountered in any species. She did not approach strangers, not from aggression, but from something more like discretion. She read people first. When the determination was favorable, she went to them fully, head and lap, full weight, no caution. The staff at the Veterans Center had watched her for 8 months, and she had not done it with a single visitor. On bad nights, when Nate lay awake in the dark, Rue would come from the foot of the bed and press herself against his side and stay there until his breathing changed. It had never taught her to do this. She had decided it on her own. The library on Montana Avenue was on his route. He had noticed the old man on the bench 2 Mondays in a row. Same time, same bench, same newspaper held at the same angle. The third Monday, Rue put her forepaws on the dash before he could drive past. He pulled to the curb. Rue was already at the passenger door before Nate had the leash in his hand. It clipped it, and they crossed the sidewalk together in the cold wind. And when they were 10 feet from the bench, the old man looked up. His eyes were gray and clear, and carried the specific quality of a man who had once been accustomed to meeting the world directly, and had, somewhere along the way, decided to stop. It was wearing the field jacket over a flannel shirt, both of them clean and pressed. This was a man who still took care of the things he had left. At his feet was a canvas bag with the corner of a library book visible at the top. His hands, on the newspaper, were large and scarred at the knuckles in the way of hands that had spent decades working with metal. Rue stopped 2 feet from the bench. She stood there. The old man looked at the dog. Rui looked at the old man. Something passed between them that Nate would not have been able to name if asked, and that he had never seen Rui do with another person. Then Rue moved slowly, without command, without the taut alertness she carried everywhere else, and she put her head in the old man's lap and closed her eyes. The old man's hands came off the newspaper. He looked at Nate, and Nate could see the question in his face. What does this mean? Why did she do that? What is this dog telling me? And Nate had no answer that would fit in a sentence, so he said only, "She doesn't do that with people." The old man looked back down at Rue. His right hand moved slowly to the top of her head. He held it there. His shoulders, which had been carrying something Nate could see from 10 feet away, moved fractionally downward. He did not speak. Nate sat down on the bench. He did not ask questions, and he did not fill the silence, because he had learned in 32 years that some silences were not problems to be solved. He sat in the cold and watched a Belgian Malinois, who never went to anyone, lie completely still in an old man's lap as though she had always been there. After a while, because something had to be said, and because Nate was who he was, he said, "You served." The old man's eyes came up. He looked at Nate's jacket, the center's logo on the chest, the small pin on the lapel that people who knew things knew meant something. He gave one nod. "Korea?" Nate said. Another nod. Slower. Something in it that was not quite grief and not quite pride. The way men acknowledge the things that define them when the world no longer seems interested in the definition. "My name's Nate," Nate said. The old man looked at him for a moment. Then he touched his own chest with 2 fingers, a gesture that Nate understood to mean, "I know you're waiting for a name." It did not give one. Nate waited. "Goose," the old man said. It came out careful, the way a door opens that has been closed a long time. One syllable, rough at the edges, like a word remembered rather than spoken. Nate nodded and did not make anything of it. "Good to meet you, Gus. Have you ever known someone like Goose? Someone who got quiet one day and never quite came back? And nobody thought to sit down next to them and wait? If that person came to mind just now, reach out to them this week. Type their name in the comments below. This section fills up with people who deserve to be remembered." It drove Goose home that first day, because the wind had sharpened and the snow was finally arriving in small hard pellets that were not quite sleet, and because Goose had a 12-block walk and shoes that were not built for ice. Goose did not protest. He directed Nate with gestures. Left at Broadwater, right on 3rd, and they pulled up to a yellow house on a corner lot with a big elm in the front yard that had been planted a long time ago by someone who intended to stay. Nate got out with Rue because that was what felt right, and Gus made no move to stop him. The front room was clean and specific. A man's room, arranged the way a man arranges things when he has known what order means and still means it even when there is no one left to share it with. On the mantel was a photograph, army dress greens, the cut of the late 1950s. A young man standing in front of a parade formation with the flat expression of someone trying not to look pleased. Beside the photograph was a folded flag in a triangle case. Beside the flag was a woman's reading glasses placed neatly on a folded cloth, as though she had just set them down and would be back. Goose saw Nate see the glasses. He didn't say anything. He went to the kitchen. Rui went to the kitchen drawer beside the stove. The long drawer, the kind where people put envelopes and important papers and the things they need to find quickly. The drawer had a small keyed cabinet lock screwed into its face, bright and new against the warm wood. Goose reached for the drawer, with the reflexive gesture of a man who had opened it 10,000 times. His hand stopped at the lock. He lowered it without touching it. "What's in there?" Nate asked. Goose looked at the drawer. He looked at Nate. He held up one finger, the gesture of a man asking for a moment, and went to the small table by the back door and took a notepad and wrote on it and handed it to Nate. The notepad said, "Bills, bank statements, my papers." Nate looked at the lock. He looked at the notepad. He looked at Goose. Goose shook his head once, slowly. The movement of a man confirming something he has known for a long time and has not known how to say. Nate put the notepad on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table, and Gus sat across from him, and Rue lay down between them on the kitchen floor. And outside the window, the snow came down for real now, the first real snow of the season, covering the old elm and the front walk and the corner lot that someone had planted a tree in with the intention of staying. Nate did not push. He let the kitchen do what kitchens do. The smell of old coffee and wood smoke and a life built in one place. And after a few minutes, Gus got up and made 2 cups of coffee without asking. And that was the arrangement. And they sat with it. It was Rue that opened the conversation. She moved from the floor to Gus's side of the table and put her head on his knee. And Gus looked down at her, and his hand went to her ear. And something that had been held for a long time began, very carefully, to loosen. It talked in the way men talk who have been silent for years, not in sentences at first, but in fragments that became sentences, then paragraphs, then something that had a shape to it. He had been a machiniste for 37 years. He had met Lorraine at a dance in 1968 and proposed 6 weeks later and been right to do it. He had a son named Warren, who worked in Denver and called on birthdays and sometimes not. He had lived in this house for 41 years. Lorraine had died 4 years ago. He had stopped talking, he said. And here the sentences slowed, because when she died, there was no one left who knew what his voice had once meant. He sighed it plainly, without asking for anything. He wrote on the notepad, Patrice came 18 months ago. Warren said it would help. Nate, read it. He nodded. Gus wrote, the drawer, the account. The mail comes to her now. Nate thought about the lock. He thought about the woman's reading glasses on the mantel, folded on a cloth, and the flag in the triangle case, and the elm in the front yard. And 41 years in one house, and Danny Park sitting in the dark 3 weeks before Kandahar, talking about a soldier at Incheon whose name his grandfather never learned. He looked at the army photograph on the mantel through the kitchen doorway. 8th Army, he said. Korea, 52, 53. Gus looked at him. His chin moved slightly. The thing that happens to a person's face when something touches something they thought was completely unreachable. He nodded. I knew someone, Nate said. He said it slowly, feeling the shape of the words. A soldier I served with. His grandfather was in Korea. Inside, an American soldier pulled him from a building at Incheon, stayed with him 2 nights until evac. A pause. His grandfather never knew the man's name. Gus had gone very still. Rue lifted her head from his knee and looked at him. Gus took the notepad. He wrote for a long time. When he handed it back, his hand was not steady. The note said, I know that story. The interpreter. His name was Lee Sung-jin. He gave me a photograph of his family before evac. I kept it for 50 years. I sent it to the VA, trying to find them, and it was never returned. Nate sat with that for a moment. Then he said, his grandson's name was Danny Park. He was my spotter. He died in Kandahar in 2019. The kitchen was very quiet. Gus looked at Nate. Nate looked at Gus. Rue lay down across both their feet and did not move, as though she had decided that was where she was needed and that was where she would stay. Ed drove back to the house on Tuesday with a folder. Monday evening, he had called the Veterans Resource Center's legal liaison, a woman named Shayla who handled elder exploitation cases 2 counties over, and described the locked drawer, the joint account, the son in Denver. She said, how soon can you get documentation? He had spent Tuesday morning photographing the lock, the cabinet hasp, the mail slot sealed from the inside with packing tape. He called Warren Pruitt in Denver and got voicemail. A called County Adult Protective Services, and the woman who answered, Gloria, cited she had a 6-week-old file on that address, and that placement paperwork for a memory care facility had been submitted to Warren for countersignature, expected back Thursday. Thursday, 2 days. Nate was in Gus's driveway when he heard Patrice on a phone call through the side window she'd left cracked. He heard Warren's name. He heard Thursday. He heard her say, clearly because he had been trained to extract information from ambient noise. He doesn't even know what day it is half the time. He sat in the truck and breathed. Rue pressed her nose toward the sound. He called Sheila back. He called Gloria back. Gloria cited a physical welfare check with formal documentation could push the Thursday timeline if filed before end of business Wednesday. Nate said he would file it himself. He called Marcus Osei, retired Army. 6 years running the center's community outreach. 19 elder exploitation cases navigated. And Marcos said, "What time Wednesday?" Then it drove to the library on Montana Avenue and found Reverend Delia Marsh in the reading room. She had seen Gus on his bench every Monday for 2 years, had brought him coffee once and never pushed. She listened to what Nate told her. She said she would be there Wednesday morning. If you were standing where Nate was standing right now, knowing what he knew with Thursday closing in, what would you have done? Be honest with yourself. Type yes or no in the comments. I read every one. Patrice Haller arrived at the house on Wednesday at 9:15. She came through the front door with the key she had made without asking, which she had done on the third day she moved in and which Gus had never been in a position to address. She came through the door in the purposeful way of a person who has decided that everything in a space belongs to her arrangements. She found Gus at the kitchen table. She found Nate Crow sitting across from him, a cup of coffee between them, and Rue on the floor between Gus's chair and the kitchen entrance. She found Gloria from Adult Protective Services at the counter with a clipboard and a camera. She found Marcos Jose standing near the hallway with the quiet solidity of a man who has been in many rooms where people tried to push, and not one of those people had succeeded. She found Reverend Delia Marsh seated at the end of the table, her coat still on, her hands folded, watching Patrice with the particular patience of a woman who has sat with grief and injustice long enough to know the difference between them. Patrice stopped in the kitchen doorway. Rue did not bark. The sound that came from her was a continuous low growl, below conversation, below argument, the sound of a judgment, delivered and not available for appeal. She moved in one motion from the floor to the space between Gus's chair and Patrice, and she stood there without command, her head level, her weight forward, her eyes fixed. Patrice looked at the dog. She looked at the room. She sighed, with the recovered smoothness of a woman who had prepared many explanations. "This is a private family matter, and I'd appreciate knowing who authorized." "Gloria authorized her own presence," Nate said. "APS has a 6-week open file on this address. The welfare check is scheduled. Gus is fine." He's fine," Nate agreed. "He's also been locked out of his own mail and his own document drawer in his own house for 18 months. He did not raise his voice. It did not need to. The placement papers for the memory care facility that Warren is signing Thursday. Gus hasn't seen them. His son hasn't spoken to him about them directly. Gloria's going to need to document whether Gus has been part of that process." Patrice turned to Gus. She used the voice she had been using for 18 months, the careful, patient, slightly louder voice of a woman addressing someone she has decided needs simplifying. "Gus, these people are confused. Why don't you tell them that everything here is, she locks the mail." 5 words. The kitchen went completely still. Patrice's mouth was open on a word that did not come out. Gus was looking at her. Not at the table, not at his hands, at her. His voice had been quiet and even and entirely without performance. The voice of a man who had been holding a specific true thing for a long time and had simply decided, in front of witnesses, to put it down. Gloria wrote something on her clipboard. Reverend Marsh looked at the table for a moment and then back at Gus with an expression that Nate would remember. Rue had not moved. The growl had not changed in register. When Patrice shifted her weight, the dog's head dropped a fraction of an inch. Patrice went still. Nate said, "The joint account that Warren co-signed for convenience. There are 18 months of transfers from it into an account in Patrice's name. Shaylee Brennan at Veterans Legal Services has the bank documentation. The memory care placement papers will be put on hold, pending a formal capacity assessment conducted by a physician of Gus's choosing, not Warren's." He paused. "Gloria is going to need to see the drawer." Ed took the key from the counter. He had found it Monday afternoon in the back of the junk drawer in the mudroom, which was where people put keys they wanted nearby but not obviously. And he put it on the table in front of Gloria. Patrice looked at the key, at Gloria, at Marcus, at Nate. The thing Nate had seen happen in rooms where the math stopped working for the person who had believed they controlled it. The specific moment of recalculation happened on Patrice Haller's face. Her hand on the doorframe went still. She left without saying another word. Rue watched the front door. The growl did not stop until the sound of Patrice's car had turned the corner and gone quiet. Then she went to Gus, and she put her head on his knee, and she closed her eyes, and Gus put his hand on the back of her neck, and he sat there with his eyes closed too, for a long time, while the snow from the night before melted in thin lines down the kitchen window. The joint account was frozen by court order within the week. The transfer documentation Sheila assembled showed 9 separate transfers over 14 months, totaling more than $40,000. Warren Pruitt drove from Denver on Thursday, not to sign placement papers, but because Nate had reached him directly Tuesday night and said 11 words no son wanted to hear about his father's house. Warren sat in that kitchen for 3 hours. When he came out, his face was the face of a man accounting for a debt he had been accruing without meaning to. Gloria's welfare check report closed the APS file with a finding of financial exploitation by a household member and full competency on Gus's part. Patrice Haller was referred for criminal prosecution. The congregation at Reverend Marsh's church organized a Tuesday lunch. Gus started attending the 3rd week of November, sat at the end of a long table, ate pot roast, listened to people talk, sometimes talked back. Nobody made anything of the difference either way, because Reverend Marsh had explained, and the congregation had understood. Marcus Ose came by one Saturday, and they fixed the rotting porch step. When they were done, Gus made coffee and they sat outside with their cups, and Marcus told a story about a base in Kandahar that made Gus laugh. A real laugh. The kind that surprises a person after a long time without one. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like a road that was always there, waiting. Laysom Jean's family gave a name to their son, the number of an American's unit, and that son told his grandson, and that grandson told a soldier in the dark 3 weeks before Kandahar. And that soldier died with his story unfinished, and it had lived inside another soldier for 3 years on a highway outside Billings, waiting for a bench and a newspaper. And a dog who already knew. Nate Crow had been carrying Danny Park's name with him for 3 years, the way you carry something that has nowhere to be set down. The Tuesday after the kitchen, after the drawer was opened and Patrice was gone, and Gus had said 5 words that changed the room, Nate had told Gus the rest of it. What happened in those last minutes? The unfinished sentence. The thing he had never said to anyone. Gus had listened without speaking. When Nate finished, Gus had been quiet for a long time. Then he said, he knew. 2 words. Nate had sat with that. He wasn't sure Gus was right. He was sure, for the first time in 3 years, that the weight had shifted. What Nate Crow did that October was not complicated. He pulled over. He sat down. He waited for a dog to do what a dog will do when it knows something the rest of us are still working out. There are people in this world who have gone quiet, not because they have nothing left to say, but because the world stopped making room for them to say it. They sit on benches. They hold newspapers. They make themselves small in the houses where they were once the tallest thing in the room. All they need sometimes is for someone to park the truck and sit down. And maybe bring the dog. Is there someone in your life who has gone quiet in a way that worries you? A veteran, a parent, a neighbor whose bench has been empty for a while? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one, and this section is full of people who deserve to be remembered. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to drive past. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.